Queens, New York is considered to be the most diverse community in the world, but I never saw it that way growing up. If you took the 7 train, you would have noticed South Asians get off around 74th Street or 82nd Street in Jackson Heights. Hispanics would get off at Junction Boulevard, 103rd Street or 111th Street. And the majority of East Asians get off at Flushing Main Street. The 7 train has a diverse line, but the communities themselves are not, and are only united by a train line. In his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Richard Rothstein discusses two concepts, de facto segregation and de jure segregation. De facto segregation is the idea that we choose to segregate ourselves with people of our own race and or ethnic background. Essentially, white people choose to live with white people, African Americans choose to live with African Americans, and Latinos choose to live with Latinos. At first, this seems like a sensible explanation. However, Richard Rothstein debunks this, claiming that the reason why our communities are segregated is not merely because of de facto segregation, but because of de jure segregation. De jure is a French phrase meaning of law. The U.S. government perpetrated this type of segregation. Here's the brief history of how de jure government policy shaped our communities. On March 4th, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn into office amidst the Great Depression. In 1934, he established the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. The primary function of the FHA was to ensure home mortgage loans made by private lenders. This program would incentivize banks and lenders to offer home mortgages, increasing homeownership across the country. The FHA was successful in stabilizing and stimulating the housing market, and it greatly benefited Americans, but it only benefited white Americans. The FHA discriminated against Black and Latino families. One of their discriminatory practices was redlining. Redlining refers to the denial of services such as loans, mortgages, or other financial assistance based on the race or ethnicity of residents who were from an area labeled as a red area. This explains why we see such a division amongst communities. The FHA only provided FHA loans to white families. In an article titled, How a New Deal Housing Program Enforced Segregation, author and lawyer Richard Collenberg explains, quote, the FHA had a manual which explicitly said that it was risky to make mortgage loans in predominantly black areas, and as a result, the federal subsidy for homeownership went almost entirely to white people. The manual that Richard Collenberg is referring to is called the Federal Housing Administration Underwriting Manual, Underwriting and Valuation Procedure under Title II of the National Housing Act, specifically the 1938 edition. The manual states the following. Areas surrounding a location are investigated to determine whether incompatible racial and social groups are present for the purpose of making a prediction regarding the probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social class and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and decline in values. This is the reason why many black families were unable to obtain an FHA loan due to the FHA predicting that the black families would lower the home values within their neighborhoods. Richard Rothstein provides an example of how the FHA was careful in avoiding mixing. In 1940, the FHA denied insurance to a private builder in Detroit because he intended to construct a housing development near a predominantly black neighborhood. The builder responded by building a 6-foot-high, 1-foot-wide, half-mile concrete wall between the black neighborhood where he planned to build. The FHA then approved to insure the loan since this wall would racially segregate the neighborhoods. The FHA strictly wanted the white neighborhoods to remain white and black neighborhoods to remain black. The deeds of many houses had a policy that a house could only be sold to white families, and if violated, the community would not receive any future FHA loans. During the Hoover administration preceding FDR's, there were campaigns persuading white middle-class families to move out of apartments and into single-family homes. In essence, they were convincing white Americans to move out of urban neighborhoods and to move into the suburbs. In Roosevelt's administration, maps were created of every metropolitan area and divided them into zones of foreclosure risk based on the race of their occupants, which is redlining. White Americans live in all-white neighborhoods would then be offered FHA loans so that they could move out and into the suburbs. This partially explains how the FHA discriminated against African American families and Latino families. In 2004-2005, the banks were offering an opportunity for African American and Latino families the chance to buy a home. However, the banks were not doing it out of charity, but strictly for more money. The banks offer the majority of African American and Latino families what is known as a subprime mortgage. These are considered bad mortgages because they have an adjustable interest rate and high fees. These type of mortgages are normally given to people with low credit scores. However, even when African American and Latino families had a sufficient credit score, they were most likely given a subprime mortgage. This is an example of predatory lending practice because brokers did not notify borrowers and even downplayed the risk that borrowers would incur. These loans looked appealing because the payments for the first 2-3 years would have low interest rates called teaser rates. However, when the mortgages resetted in 2006 and 2007, by reset, I mean the interest rate switches from the teaser rate to a new floating rate. Essentially, the calculations for the interest rate switches to a new calculation where the interest rate becomes higher. Borrowers would see their interest rate jump, so they would see their monthly payments skyrocket to 30 to 50%, which many families simply could not afford and were not warned of. When the housing bubble ended, many homes fell in value, erasing homeowners' equity, so families could not refinance or sell their houses to avoid the higher payments. On top of that, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate 17 times from June 2004 to June 2006, from an interest rate of 1% to 5.25%. With all this combined, many homes were foreclosed and many houses were sold for less than what the families paid for. Essentially, these families were left with nothing. This is how African American and Latino families were discriminated against by our own government and how we were taken advantage of by the big banks. The policies of the past continue to haunt us and they shape the injustices we face today. The American dream is meant for all, but we continue to face discrimination today. Thank you for watching.